I never thought installing a heat pump would turn into a legal nightmare. But that was before I met Brenda Carmichael, the HOA president who believed my property was her personal resource center. It started on a frigid January morning in 2025 in Greenville, South Carolina. I had just finished my morning coffee when the doorbell rang insistently, 3 sharp bursts that already set my teeth on edge. When I opened the door, a woman in her mid-50s stood on my porch, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful, and she wore a pearl necklace that probably cost more than my mortgage payment. "Marcus Lawson?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "That's me," I said, keeping my hand on the door. "I'm Brenda Carmichael, president of the Riverside Estates Homeowners Association. I need to discuss your recent installation." I had moved into this neighborhood 6 months ago, a quiet community of ranch-style homes built in the 1980s. The HOA had seemed reasonable during the buying process, just basic rules about lawn maintenance and exterior colors. I had followed every regulation to the letter when I installed my new geothermal heat pump system last month, even getting written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. "The heat pump, I got approval for that," I said. Yes, I know about the approval," Brenda said, waving her hand dismissively. "I'm here about something else. May I come in?" Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. Brenda walked into my living room like she owned the place, her heels clicking on my hardwood floors. She didn't wait for an invitation to sit, just planted herself on my couch and pulled out a stack of papers. "I've been doing research on your heating system," she said. "Geothermal heat pumps are incredibly efficient. You must be saving hundreds on your electricity bills." "That's kind of the point," I said, remaining standing. "What's this about?" "Well, Marcus, I'll get straight to it. My heating system is ancient, and my bills this winter have been astronomical. Nearly $400 last month alone. Meanwhile, you're sitting on a system that produces abundant heat for a fraction of the cost." She smiled, and it reminded me of a shark. "I think it's only fair that you share that resource with your neighbors, specifically with me since my home is right next door." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "You want me to share my heat?" "Exactly. I've already spoken to a contractor. He said it would be simple to run a line from your system to my house. You'd barely notice the difference, and it would save me so much money." "That's not how this works," I said slowly. "First, connecting our systems would require major modifications. Second, it would increase my electricity usage and wear on my equipment. Third, and most importantly, why would I do that?" Brenda's smile tightened. "Because we're neighbors, Marcus. Because it's the right thing to do. Because this community is built on people helping each other." Helping each other is one thing. Giving away free utilities is another. If you want to use my heating system, we'd need to discuss compensation. Her face flushed red. "Compensation? You're going to charge me to be a good neighbor." "I'm going to charge you to use an expensive system that I paid $25,000 to install," I said. "That's how this works." Brenda stood up abruptly. "I see. Well, I thought you were a reasonable person, Marcus, but clearly I was wrong. I'll be discussing this with the board." She stormed out and I closed the door behind her, shaking my head. I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I found a notice on my door. The HOA was fining me $500 for non-compliance with community standards. The violation: my heat pump's outdoor unit was allegedly creating excessive noise. This was ridiculous, because the unit was one of the quietest models on the market, and I had specifically chosen it to avoid disturbing neighbors. I immediately called the HOA management company and requested a hearing. They scheduled it for the following week, which meant I had 7 days to prepare. I spent that time gathering documentation, the manufacturer's specifications showing the unit operated at 38 decibels, quieter than normal conversation. Recordings I took at various times of day proving the noise level was minimal, and testimonials from other neighbors who said they never heard anything. The hearing was held at the community center on a Tuesday evening. I arrived 15 minutes early to find Brenda already there, sitting at a long table with 4 other board members. I recognized 2 of them, Tom and Sandra Morrison, a retired couple who lived at the end of the street. The others I had seen around but never met. "Mr. Lawson, please sit," Brenda said, gesturing to a chair positioned in front of their table like I was on trial. "We're here to discuss your violation of the noise ordinance." "Which I didn't violate," I said, sitting down and pulling out my folder. "I have documentation showing that my heat pump operates well below any reasonable noise threshold." "That's not what I've experienced," Brenda said. "The noise from your unit has been keeping me awake at night. It's a constant hum that penetrates right through my bedroom wall." "Your bedroom is on the opposite side of your house from my heat pump," I pointed out. "I know because I looked at the property layouts. There's no way you're hearing it from there." One of the other board members, a thin man with glasses who introduced himself as Robert Chen, spoke up. "Do you have any proof of these measurements you're claiming?" I handed out copies of the manufacturer's specifications and my own recordings. "The unit operates at 38 decibels. For reference, a refrigerator is about 40 decibels. My recordings, which were taken at my property line closest to Brenda's house, show readings between 35 and 40 decibels, and that includes ambient noise." Tom Morrison studied the documents, his bushy white eyebrows drawing together. "This looks pretty thorough." "Brenda, have you actually measured the noise level?" "I don't need to measure it," Brenda snapped. "I know what I hear." "Actually, you do need to measure it," I said. "The HOA's own noise ordinance specifies that violations must be documented with actual decibel readings taken at the property line. Do you have any such readings?" The silence that followed was telling. Finally, Sandra Morrison cleared her throat. "We should table this until we can get proper measurements." "Absolutely not," Brenda said. "I'm the one living next to this thing. My complaint should be sufficient." "But it's not sufficient according to our own rules," Robert said, flipping through a copy of the HOA bylaws. "Mr. Lawson is correct. We need documented evidence." Brenda's face was turning an alarming shade of purple. "Fine, we'll get measurements. But in the meantime, I'm also citing Mr. Lawson for failure to maintain community standards under Article 7, Section 3, which allows the board to enforce violations based on aesthetic concerns." "What aesthetic concerns?" I asked. "My yard is maintained, my house is painted an approved color, and my heat pump unit is screened by the same type of fence that dozens of other homes use for their AC units." "The fence isn't tall enough," Brenda said quickly. "The unit is visible from certain angles." "The fence is 6 feet tall, which is the maximum height allowed by HOA regulations," I said. "If I made it taller, I'd be in violation of a different rule." This hearing continued in circles for another 30 minutes. Finally, the other board members agreed to suspend the fines pending proper noise measurements and an inspection of the fence height. Brenda looked like she wanted to murder someone, probably me, but she was outvoted. I left feeling relieved but wary. This wasn't over. My instincts were correct. 2 days later, I came home from work to find a crew in my yard. They were from the HOA's landscaping company, and they were digging up my front flower bed. "What are you doing?" I shouted, running over. "HOA work order," the foreman said, showing me a document. Says we're supposed to remove non-approved plantings. I looked at my flower bed. I had planted it in the fall with tulip bulbs and some ornamental grasses, all species that were explicitly listed as approved in the HOA's landscaping guidelines. These are all approved plants. Not according to this, the foreman said, pointing to the work order which listed my plantings as invasive species. That's completely false. Who authorized this? Brenda Carmichael. She's the HOA president. I immediately called the police. While I waited for them to arrive, I took photos and videos of everything, the work crew, the torn-up flower bed, and the work order with Brenda's signature. When the officer arrived, a young woman named Officer Patricia Hayes, I explained the situation. "This is technically a civil matter," she said after reviewing everything. "But they shouldn't be on your property without your permission. I can ask them to leave. Please do." Officer Hayes spoke with the foreman, who called his company's office. After a heated discussion, the crew packed up and left. I was relieved until I saw what they had already done. Half my flower bed was destroyed, bulbs torn from the ground and ornamental grasses ripped out by the roots. I documented everything and sent a demand letter to the HOA management company the next day. I wanted reimbursement for the plants, which had cost me about $300, and I wanted a formal apology. I also filed a complaint about Brenda's conduct, citing harassment and abuse of her position. The response I got was not what I expected. The HOA's lawyer sent me a letter threatening legal action if I continued to make baseless accusations against board members. They also denied any wrongdoing regarding the flower bed, claiming that Brenda had acted on reasonable concerns about plant species. This was escalating beyond anything I had imagined. I decided I needed my own lawyer. I found James Patterson, a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. He was in his 40s, with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude that I immediately appreciated. "This is a clear case of selective enforcement and harassment," James said after reviewing my documentation. "The question is, what do you want to do about it?" "I want her to leave me alone," I said, "and I want to be reimbursed for my plants. We can send a cease and desist letter, but honestly, that might just make her angrier. People like this often see legal pushback as a personal challenge. We should be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better." He was right. The cease and desist letter was delivered on a Friday. By Monday morning, I had 3 new violation notices. One claimed my trash cans were visible from the street, even though they were in my garage with the door closed. Another said my mailbox was dented and needed replacement, which was true, but it had been that way since before I moved in, and nobody had cared until now. The third claimed I was operating a business from my home in violation of HOA rules. That last one was particularly galling because it was based on nothing. I worked as a software engineer for a company in Charlotte. And yes, I worked from home 2 days a week, but that wasn't operating a business. When I called the management company to dispute it, they said Brenda had provided photographic evidence of commercial vehicles at my property. "What commercial vehicles?" I demanded. They emailed me the photos. One showed a FedEx truck making a delivery. Another showed my friend Dave's pickup truck, which he had driven over for a barbecue the previous weekend. The truck had his plumbing company's logo on the side because he used it for work, but he had just been visiting as a friend. "This is insane," I told James when I forwarded him the photos. "She's just making things up now. It's harassment, plain and simple," James agreed. "I think it's time we filed suit. We can go after her personally for harassment and the HOA for allowing this behavior." Before I could decide on that course of action, things took an even stranger turn. I was leaving for work on a Wednesday morning when Brenda appeared in my driveway. She was carrying a folder and wearing what I assumed was her version of a friendly smile. "Marcus, do you have a minute?" she asked. "Not really," I said, unlocking my car. "I need to get to work." "This will only take a moment. I've been thinking about our situation, and I believe I've found a solution that will make everyone happy." Despite my better judgment, I paused. "What solution?" "I've drafted a new agreement," she said, opening her folder and pulling out a document. "If you agree to provide heating to my home, I'll drop all the violations and we can go back to being friendly neighbors." I took the document and skimmed it. It was titled Good Neighbor Resource Sharing Agreement, and it outlined how I would provide supplemental heating to Brenda's home through a connection to my geothermal system. In exchange, she would pay me the princely sum of $50 per month. $50, I said. "Brenda, do you have any idea how much this would cost me? The installation alone would be thousands of dollars. The increased electricity usage would probably run $200 a month or more. The extra wear on my system would shorten its lifespan, and you want to pay me $50. "It's a very generous offer, considering you'd be getting heat yourself anyway," Brenda said. "The incremental cost to you is minimal." "That's not how this works. If I were going to do this, which I'm not, the cost would need to reflect actual market rates. Based on the contractor estimates I've seen for similar setups, we'd be looking at installation costs of around $8,000 and monthly fees of at least $300 to $400. Brenda's friendly mask slipped. "That's extortion." "No, that's business." "But again, I'm not interested in doing this at any price. My system was designed for my house, not yours." "I see," Brenda said coldly. "Then I suppose we'll be proceeding with the violations." I should also mention that the board is considering a special assessment to fund upgrades to the community center. Your share would be around $12,000. You can't do that. Special assessments require approval from a majority of homeowners, which I'm confident we'll get once people understand the need. Of course, if you were being a cooperative neighbor, I might find ways to reduce your share. Everything is negotiable, Marcus. I got in my car without responding and drove away. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. This had crossed from harassment into extortion. When I got to the office, I immediately called James and told him what had happened. "That's it," James said. "We're filing suit today. I'm going to request an emergency restraining order based on this threat." "Can you write down exactly what she said while it's fresh in your memory?" I spent my lunch break documenting the conversation in excruciating detail. James filed our lawsuit that afternoon, naming both Brenda Carmichael and the Riverside Estates, HOA, as defendants. We alleged harassment, abuse of power, extortion, and sought damages for the destroyed flower bed, legal fees, and emotional distress. The lawsuit was served to Brenda 2 days later. I wasn't there to see her reaction, but I heard about it from Sandra Morrison, who called me that evening. "Marcus, I want you to know that not everyone on the board supports what Brenda's been doing," Sandra said. "Tom and I have been very uncomfortable with her behavior, but she's very intimidating. Now that there's a lawsuit, though, we have grounds to take action. We're calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow night, and we're going to discuss her removal as president." "I appreciate that," I said. "But honestly, I just want all of this to stop." "I understand. I'm hoping we can resolve this reasonably. Tom and I will be voting to drop all the violations against you and to issue a formal apology." The emergency board meeting happened, but I wasn't allowed to attend since it was about internal board matters. I waited anxiously at home that evening, checking my phone every few minutes. Finally, around 9 o'clock, Sandra called. "It's done," she said. "We voted 3-2 to remove Brenda as president. Robert will be taking over as interim president. We're also appointing an independent investigator to review all violation cases from the past 6 months to ensure they were legitimate." "What about Brenda?" "She's still on the board, unfortunately. We can't remove her completely without a vote from the full membership, but she no longer has executive authority." I felt relief wash over me. "Thank you, Sandra." "Don't thank me yet. Brenda did not take this well. She stormed out threatening to sue everyone. I'm worried about what she might do next." Sandra's worry was justified. The next morning I woke up to police officers knocking on my door. It was barely 6 o'clock. "Marcus Lawson?" the officer asked when I opened the door, still in my pajamas. "Yes, we have a report of theft of services. We need to ask you some questions." I let them in, completely confused. There were 2 officers, the older one, Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, and a younger officer named Chris Bowen. They sat in my living room while I made coffee, trying to wake up enough to understand what was happening. "Can you explain your relationship with Brenda Carmichael?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked. I gave them the whole story, from Brenda's initial demand for free heat to the lawsuit I had filed. By the time I finished, both officers looked skeptical of the complaint. "So, to be clear, you've never provided any heating services to Miss Carmichael?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked. "Never. I've never connected my system to her house in any way. And she's claiming you did, that you agreed to provide heat and are now demanding payment. That's insane." "I have documentation of everything, including her initial demand and my refusal." I showed them the texts, emails, and the ridiculous agreement she had tried to get me to sign. The officers took notes and photos of everything. "Mr. Lawson, I'm not going to arrest you," Sergeant Rodriguez said. "This is clearly a civil dispute, not a criminal matter. Miss Carmichael seems to have misrepresented the situation. We'll be filing a report to that effect." After they left, I called James and told him what had happened. "She filed a false police report," James said. "That's actually a crime. We can add this to our lawsuit, and you might want to consider filing charges against her." "Will that actually go anywhere?" "It might. False reporting is taken seriously, especially when it's done maliciously. I'll reach out to the prosecutor's office." Over the next few days, things escalated rapidly. Brenda, apparently furious that her police complaint had backfired, began a campaign to turn the neighborhood against me. She went door to door telling people that I was suing the HOA and that everyone's dues would increase to cover legal fees. She conveniently left out the part about why I was suing. Some of my neighbors believed her. I started getting dirty looks when I checked my mail. Someone egged my car. Another person left a nasty note in my mailbox telling me to drop the lawsuit or else. But other neighbors reached out with support. Dave, my plumber friend whose truck had been photographed, was furious when he heard the full story. A couple across the street, Jennifer and Paul Wagner, invited me over for dinner and told me they had dealt with Brenda's harassment the previous year over a fence dispute. "She tried to fine us every week for months," Jennifer said. "Finally, we just paid to replace the entire fence even though it was fine, just to make it stop. I wish we had stood up to her like you're doing." "It's not fun," I admitted, "but I can't let her keep doing this." The independent investigator appointed by the board completed his review 2 weeks after Brenda was removed as president. His report was damning. Of the 47 violations issued in the previous 6 months, 32 were found to be baseless or improperly documented. 11 of those were against me. The report also found that Brenda had issued violations almost exclusively to people she had personal disputes with. The board voted to rescind all improper violations and issue refunds to homeowners who had paid fines. They also passed a new rule requiring that all future violations be approved by at least 2 board members and properly documented before being issued. Brenda was censured, but remained on the board. At the next general membership meeting, which I made sure to attend, she stood up during the open forum period. "I want everyone here to understand what's happening," she announced. "Marcus Lawson is trying to destroy this community because I asked him to be a good neighbor. He's weaponizing lawyers and forcing us to spend thousands on legal fees, money that comes from your dues, all because he's too selfish to share resources that cost him nothing." "That's not true," I said, standing up. "I'm happy to explain what actually happened." I laid out the entire timeline, from Brenda's initial demand for free heat to her threats and false police report. I showed copies of the documents, which I had brought precisely for this purpose. By the time I finished, the mood in the room had shifted dramatically. "I think we've heard enough," said an older man I didn't recognize. "I move that we hold a special election to remove Brenda Carmichael from the board entirely." The motion was seconded and discussed. Brenda tried to defend herself, but her explanations only made things worse. When she claimed that my heat pump was community infrastructure because it increased property values, several people laughed out loud. The vote was held 2 weeks later. Brenda was removed from the board by a margin of 73 to 12. She showed up to the meeting where the results were announced and had to be escorted out by security after she began screaming at people. I thought this would finally be the end of it. I was wrong again. 3 days after being removed from the board, Brenda did something that crossed the line from harassment to criminal activity. I came home from work to find my heat pump's outdoor unit had been vandalized. Someone had taken a sledgehammer to it, destroying the compressor and bending the copper lines. The damage was extensive, easily $10,000 or more to repair. I immediately called the police. Sergeant Rodriguez responded, along with Officer Hayes, who I had met during the flower bed incident. "You have security cameras?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked. "I do now," I said. "I had installed them 2 weeks earlier after my car had been egged. Let me pull up the footage." The video was clear. At 2:15 that afternoon, Brenda had walked into my yard carrying a sledgehammer. She had looked around, apparently checking for witnesses, and then proceeded to destroy my heat pump unit. The video captured her face clearly and even recorded her saying, "Try selling your heat now, you bastard," before she left. "Well, that's pretty conclusive," Officer Hayes said. "We'll be arresting her for criminal mischief and vandalism." They left to pick up Brenda. I called my insurance company and then James to let him know what had happened. "This is actually good for our case," James said, though he sounded sympathetic about the situation. "Well, not good that it happened, but it strengthens our position significantly. We're going to amend our complaint to include the vandalism." The insurance adjuster came out the next day and confirmed the damage would cost $12,000 to repair. My deductible was $1,000, which meant I was out that much immediately. The HVAC company said they could get the parts in a week, but it would take another week to complete the repairs. In the meantime, it was mid-February, and temperatures were dropping into the 30s at night. I had to rent space heaters to keep my house warm, adding insult to injury. The daily rental costs added up quickly, another expense that would ultimately come back to Brenda, assuming she ever had to pay. Brenda was arrested that evening. She was charged with felony criminal mischief because the damage exceeded $5,000. She posted bail the next morning and immediately violated the no-contact order that had been issued by calling my phone. "You're destroying my life," she screamed when I answered without checking the caller ID. "I'm going to lose everything because of you." "You destroyed your own life, Brenda," I said. "And you destroyed my heat pump. Don't ever call me again." I reported the call to the police, and Brenda was arrested again for violating the protective order. This time, the judge set a higher bail and warned her that any further contact with me would result in her being held without bail until trial. The criminal case moved faster than the civil suit. Brenda's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor's office was not particularly sympathetic. The video evidence was too clear, and Brenda's pattern of harassment was well documented. They offered her a deal where she would plead guilty to felony criminal mischief, pay full restitution for my damages including the insurance deductible and space heater costs, serve 2 years of probation, and complete anger management counseling. Brenda refused the deal. She insisted on going to trial, apparently convinced that a jury would see things her way once they understood how unreasonable I had been. The trial took place in late April. I had to take 3 days off work to attend, which was stressful, but I wanted to see this through. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Lisa Chen, built a methodical case. She presented the video evidence, my testimony about Brenda's escalating behavior, and testimony from other neighbors about Brenda's pattern of harassment. Brenda's lawyer tried to argue that she had been under extreme emotional distress, that my refusal to help her with heating costs had caused her significant financial hardship, and that her actions, while wrong, were understandable. The jury didn't buy it. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge was blunt. "Miss Carmichael, you engaged in a sustained campaign of harassment against your neighbor because he wouldn't give you something you had no right to. When that didn't work, you destroyed his property in an act of revenge. This court takes such behavior very seriously." Brenda was sentenced to 90 days in jail, which was actually higher than the typical sentence for first-time property crimes, 3 years of probation after her release, 500 hours of community service, mandatory anger management counseling, and restitution in the amount of $14,800 to cover my insurance deductible, space heater rentals, lost wages from attending court, and my legal fees related to the criminal case. The civil suit was still pending, but Brenda's criminal conviction made it much simpler. Her lawyer approached James about settlement discussions. We agreed to mediation in June. At the mediation, Brenda looked like a different person. She had lost weight, her hair was streaked with more gray, and the aggressive confidence she had displayed before was gone. She was accompanied by her lawyer and her husband, Donald, a quiet man I had seen around the neighborhood but never spoken to. "My client recognizes that her actions were inappropriate," Brenda's lawyer began. "She's prepared to offer a settlement to resolve all outstanding civil matters." "We're listening," James said. The offer was comprehensive. Brenda would pay me $35,000 to cover the destroyed flower bed, additional legal fees, emotional distress, and the costs associated with the HOA violations I had fought. The HOA, through its insurance, would contribute another $15,000 and issue a formal apology. Both Brenda and the HOA would agree to a permanent injunction preventing any further harassment or retaliatory actions. Brenda would also resign from the HOA board permanently and agree not to seek election again. "What about the false police report?" I asked. "My client maintains that was a misunderstanding, not a deliberate false report," the lawyer said carefully. "The police report says otherwise," James countered. but I think for purposes of settlement, we can treat it as part of the overall harassment pattern rather than a separate issue. We negotiated for another hour over details. Finally, we reached an agreement. Brenda would pay $40,000 total, the HOA would pay $20,000, and both would be bound by the injunction and apology terms. The settlement also included a provision that if Brenda violated the terms in any way, the amount owed would double. "I need to hear from you directly," I said to Brenda when the lawyers finished drafting the settlement terms. "I need to know that you understand why what you did was wrong." Brenda was silent for a long moment. Her lawyer started to speak, but she held up her hand to stop him. "I was jealous," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You had this new efficient system, and I was struggling with high heating bills. Donald had just retired and money was tight. When you wouldn't help me, I felt like you were being deliberately cruel. I convinced myself that you were the bad guy, that you owed the community something. I was wrong. I know that now. What I did to you was terrible, and I'm sorry." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it felt genuine. I nodded. "Okay, I accept your apology. Let's sign this and be done with it." The settlement was finalized that day. The payments were structured so that I received the HOA's $20,000 immediately and Brenda's payment in 2 installments, $25,000 immediately and $15,000 after 6 months, assuming she complied with all other terms. Brenda served her 90 days in jail starting in July. Donald listed their house for sale in August, and they moved out of the neighborhood in October. I heard through the grapevine that they relocated to a condo in Florida, somewhere with no HOA drama. Life slowly returned to normal. The new HOA board, led by Robert Chen, implemented reforms to prevent future abuses of power. All violations now required documentation and approval from multiple board members. They established an appeal process with neutral third-party arbitrators. They even created a committee to review and streamline the rules, eliminating outdated and petty regulations. My heat pump was fully repaired and working perfectly. My flower bed was replanted, and the new bulbs came up beautifully in the spring. The hostility from neighbors who had believed Brenda's lies faded as the truth came out. Dave still teases me about the whole incident. "Man, you paid $25,000 for a heat pump and got into a war over it," he said over beers one evening. "Was it worth it, the heat pump?" "Absolutely. It's saving me a fortune. The war. I wish it had never happened, but I'm glad I stood my ground." Jennifer Wagner organized a neighborhood barbecue that summer, partly to welcome new residents and partly to celebrate the HOA reforms. It was a beautiful July afternoon, warm but not too hot, perfect for grilling and socializing. Robert Chen gave a short speech about the changes the board had implemented. "We learned some hard lessons this year," Robert said. "About power, about responsibility, and about treating our neighbors with respect. This community is stronger now because one person had the courage to stand up against unfairness. So let's raise our glasses to Marcus." I was embarrassed by the attention but touched by the sentiment. The neighborhood really did feel different now. People were friendlier, more relaxed. The constant anxiety about HOA violations had lifted. The remaining settlement payment from Brenda came through right on schedule in December. With all the legal battles behind me, I finally felt like I could fully move on. I used some of the settlement money to upgrade my home office, since I was working remotely more often. I also donated a chunk to a local legal aid organization that helped homeowners fight abusive HOAs. If my nightmare could help other people avoid similar situations, that seemed worthwhile. I ran into Donald one more time, completely by chance. I was in Charleston visiting a client when I saw him at a coffee shop. He recognized me at the same moment I recognized him. "Marcus," he said, walking over hesitantly. I wasn't sure if I should say hello. "It's fine," I said. "How are you? How's Brenda?" "We're doing better. Florida is good for us. The condo is small, but we don't have to deal with all the neighborhood politics." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "I want you to know I had no idea what Brenda was doing. I mean, I knew she was upset about the heating costs, but I didn't know she was harassing you or planning anything. If I had known, I would have stopped her." "I believe you," I said. "I never thought you were involved. She's getting help." "Real help, not just the court-ordered stuff. She's on medication for anxiety now, and she's seeing a therapist twice a week. She knows she has a problem with control and anger. It's a long road, but she's trying." "I'm glad to hear that," I said, and I meant it. I had never wanted to destroy Brenda's life. I had just wanted her to leave me alone. We talked for a few more minutes before parting ways. It was a strange, slightly melancholy conversation, but it gave me closure. Back in Greenville, life continued to improve. The neighborhood became genuinely pleasant to live in. The new HOA board focused on actual community improvements rather than petty enforcement. They organized regular social events, upgraded the community center's playground, and even negotiated a group discount with a local landscaping company for residents who wanted to use their services. I made real friends among my neighbors. Paul Wagner and I started a weekly poker game with some other guys from the neighborhood. Sandra and Tom Morrison invited me over for dinner regularly, and Sandra's cooking was amazing. I even started dating someone, a woman named Hannah Grant who lived a few streets over. She was a pediatric nurse with a sharp sense of humor and a refreshing lack of drama. "So you're the guy who went to war with the HOA," Hannah said on our first date, grinning. "Is that going to be a problem?" I asked. "Are you kidding? I think it's great. Brenda Carmichael was terrible. She tried to fine me once because my car was parked facing the wrong direction on the street. Not illegally parked, just facing the wrong way. She said it was aesthetically displeasing. We laughed about it, but it reminded me how widespread Brenda's tyranny had been. The reforms the board implemented were helping everyone, not just me. A year after the settlement, I attended the annual HOA meeting. These had been dreaded events under Brenda's leadership, but the atmosphere was completely different now. Robert Chen presented the financial report, which showed the association was in good shape. They had even built up a healthy reserve fund by cutting unnecessary expenses, like paying for violations that would just be appealed and overturned. During the open forum, several residents spoke about their appreciation for the changes. One woman, elderly Mrs. Patterson from the corner house, got emotional as she thanked the board for making the neighborhood feel welcoming again. "I've lived here for 32 years, she said. "The last few years had gotten so unpleasant that my son was trying to convince me to sell and move into assisted living. But now I feel at home again. This is a community, not a dictatorship." The meeting ended with a vote on proposed rule changes, including a measure to limit how long someone could serve as HOA president. It passed overwhelmingly. The neighborhood was ensuring that what happened with Brenda could never happen again. As I walked home that evening, I reflected on the entire experience. It had been exhausting, expensive, and stressful. There were times when I had questioned whether it was worth the fight, whether I should have just moved and cut my losses. But looking at the community now, seeing how much better things were for everyone, I knew I had made the right choice. My heat pump continued to work flawlessly, saving me hundreds of dollars every month on utilities. It had paid for itself faster than I had expected, and it would continue saving money for decades. Every time I walked past the outdoor unit, now fully repaired and protected by my security cameras, I felt a strange mix of pride and relief. Hannah and I got more serious over that year. She moved in with me that fall, bringing her dog, a goofy golden retriever named Biscuit, who immediately became the neighborhood favorite. We hosted Thanksgiving dinner for friends and neighbors, a warm, chaotic gathering that filled the house with laughter. "I'm glad you fought back against Brenda," Hannah told me later that night as we cleaned up. "Not just for you, but for everyone. She would have just kept getting worse." "Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies," I said, "even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Dave, ever the pragmatist, summed it up differently when he heard I was thinking about writing down the whole story. "Man, you got into a fight with a crazy lady over free heat. She went to jail and you got 50 grand out of it. That's the most expensive heat anyone's ever not gotten." He wasn't wrong, but it was never really about the heat. It was about boundaries, respect, and refusing to let someone abuse their power. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it would have been easier to give in. The neighborhood continued to thrive. Property values increased, partly because word got out that the HOA was reasonable and well managed now. New families moved in, drawn by the community atmosphere. The Carmichaels' old house was bought by a young couple with 2 kids who immediately became active in neighborhood activities. I eventually did write down the whole story, partly as a form of therapy and partly because I thought it might help others dealing with HOA problems. I posted it on a few online forums for homeowners, and the response was overwhelming. Dozens of people reached out to share their own HOA horror stories and to thank me for showing that it was possible to fight back successfully. Some people asked if I regretted buying in an HOA community. The honest answer was no. Most HOAs are fine, run by reasonable people who just want to maintain property values and keep the neighborhood pleasant. The problem comes when someone like Brenda gets power and uses it to bully others. The key is having proper checks and balances, which our neighborhood now had in place. I also learned a lot about legal rights and processes that I had never thought about before. I learned that documentation is everything, that you should never assume authorities will automatically take your side, and that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to stand up to them with every tool at your disposal. The criminal justice system worked the way it was supposed to in this case. Brenda committed crimes, she was prosecuted, she was convicted, and she faced consequences. The civil system also worked, providing me with compensation for the harm she caused. Were the systems perfect? No. The process was slow, expensive, and stressful, but ultimately justice was served. 2 years after everything started, I stood in my backyard on a cold January morning, much like the morning when Brenda had first knocked on my door. My heat pump hummed quietly, keeping my house warm and comfortable. Hannah was inside making breakfast, and Biscuit was running around the yard chasing birds. I thought about how different my life might have been if I had just given in to Brenda's initial demand. Maybe I would have connected our systems, paid thousands for installation, watched my electricity bills skyrocket, and still ended up on her bad side when something inevitably went wrong. Or maybe I would have refused but not fought back against her harassment, eventually selling the house at a loss to escape the situation. Instead, I had stood my ground. It cost me time, money, and stress in the short term, but in the long term, it made my life and my community better. Brenda got the help she needed, even if it took criminal charges to make that happen. The neighborhood got reforms that protected everyone. And I got peace, compensation, and the satisfaction of knowing I had done the right thing. The heat pump continued its quiet hum, a constant reminder of where it all started. But now, instead of being a source of conflict, it was just what it was always supposed to be: an efficient, reliable system that kept me comfortable while saving money. And it was mine, not community property, not something I owed to demanding neighbors, just mine. I went back inside to join Hannah for breakfast, grateful for how things had turned out and ready to enjoy the warm home I had fought so hard to protect.